we went along on the march for a while, not really knowing what to expect. We had all seen the Japanese up close, and we knew what the uniforms looked like. We knew everything about them. But I remember at one point looking at one of these Jap soldiers, and he looked just like a picture I'd had in the history book of Attila the Hun. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good description. But we went on our way, and I developed a fine skill of being unnoticed. I found that anybody who attracted attention would almost invariably get the wrong kind of attention. About halfway along, when people would come alongside of the road and they would give us V for victory, and if they could, they'd pass to us little packets of rice wrapped in banana leaves. At this point, a little girl, she was about adolescent or thereabouts, and she ran up to the line and gave a soldier a packet of rice, and there was a Japanese soldier coming right up to her, and he didn't like what had happened. He knocked that packet of rice to the ground, took his rifle butt and smashed her right in the center of the face. And you could hear the bones of her head crushing. They were just like somebody had stuck a hatchet into a melon, just crushed her. And she dropped to the ground like a rag doll. And the other Japanese soldiers were unhappy about that, but they couldn't do anything. We couldn't do anything. And the little girl was just dropped like a rag doll. Later, about half an hour later, we were going along a little farther, and a Filipino signaled to some of us. There was a man from the 19th POW was near me, and the Filipino ran up to give him the packet of rice, handed to him, and a rifle shot rang out, and the Filipino dropped. And apparently it was the same guy that had hit the little girl, had fired the shot. And the packet of rice dropped no more than 2 or 3 feet away from the guy in the 19th POW. And he hesitated for just a second. I told him, I said, don't do it. It isn't worth it. And he thought it over. He was hungry, and he was going to go for it. So he did, and that rifle shot again, and he dropped right over the packet of rice. That was about the way it went.
They marched us back to some place, I don't know the name of it, where we sat down for a while and then eventually marched on farther to a rail spur. And then we were put in 40 and 8s, and they are designed to hold 40 men or 8 horses. They're much smaller than American boxcars, as you probably know. They crammed about 70 or 75 of us in there. You couldn't all sit down or stand at the same time. We had about half of us would try to walk in a circle, and the other half would sit. And then we'd change positions. Well, Christmas Day, I think we were in the boxcar somewhere between 7 and 8 days. But anyhow, Christmas Day was the 5th day. I do recall that, because the Germans were singing Christmas carols outside. And I found out later it took us almost 9 days to move 200 miles. That's how bad our planes had the tracks shot up. So eventually, we got no food while we were in there. They put in 2 buckets of water a day. And we got Did not get out at all for latrine purposes. Fortunately, it was cold and all the excrement froze. If it had been summertime, it would have been terrible. But a couple of guys died in there. And the only thing we could do with them was stack them one on top of the other and use them for a seat. But we headed on up to Hammelburg. They put us in the Stalag at Hammelburg. That's the same one that Patton's son-in-law was in. And you recall perhaps he launched a big raid to try to save him and lost his whole column in there. But anyhow, I was at Hammelburg for, several weeks, I guess. And we got no breakfast in Hammelburg. We were in stables, quartered in stables, stone stables, and it was cold, around zero. And you had one little tiny coal-fired heater in there. And if you were more than 3 feet from there, you were cold. We slept on a board, had one blanket, and we got no breakfast. We got a dipper of tea at noon, and we got 2 little new potatoes about the size of small eggs for dinner. Well, I soon found there was a method to that. After feeding us that type of fare for about a week, they came in and said, now, if you will volunteer to go out and work, you'll get better food. Well, I was a non-com, so I didn't have to volunteer. But I figured it couldn't be any worse than this, so I did volunteer. I had been holding church services in the Stalag there. They let me do that, and I kind of hated to give that up, but seemed like it was going to be a matter of survival. So I was put on a train, sent down the Main. The Main River is the one that runs through Frankfurt. It's Frankfurt on Main. Well, we were north of Frankfurt. There was a fairly good-sized town called Markheidenfeld, but then we were put into, the fellows that volunteered that they sent down there, there's 53 of us, we were sent to a little village called Hoffenlohr. And we were told we were going to work in a factory. Well, it was some factory. We were put into some barracks about a quarter mile from the factory out of this little village. All 53 of us, this barracks. But this factory that they put us in was a baby crib factory.
It would go in streaks. It would be they'd be halfway civilized to us, and other times they wouldn't be. Well, some of the guards they all had English in high school when they went to school, but they couldn't, you can't, just like if you studied Spanish in school, you couldn't go to Mexico and talk Spanish to them, and they couldn't do that. But they were all, some of the ones that were more humane would want to practice their English. One day he asked them if tables were turned. Now this is what he asked them, and this is what he was thinking. If tables were turned, and he was a prisoner, and they were the guards, would they come in and cut his throat at night? Now that's what the guard asked them. Well, they didn't have any idea what he talked about, and they wanted to agree with him about everything because he was good to them. So they said, oh yeah. Well, that whole detail turned into a hell detail. And that night, that they took, they started beating us if we didn't go fast with a pick handle, to make us go faster and everything like that. We couldn't figure out what was wrong. And that night, they took the guys from that mining car. There was 3 or 4 of them on each car. I can't remember for sure. And then the mining car above that, next to them, and the one on each side of them. So there was probably 7, 8, 9 people there. And the Japs guards lived on one side, and we lived on the other side. And they had a flagpole with a flaming there in the center. Well, they tied those guys to the flagpole there, and they got pick handles, and they beat those guys unmercifully for about 4 o'clock till dark, till after dark, and they just beat them as hard as they could on the backs with those pick handles, and when they turned them loose and brought them back to camp, they couldn't hardly walk or anything. They were all beat to pieces, and none of those guys ever worked again. And they sent them away to where they had an American hospital, not America, a hospital for prisoners at Bilibid, an old Spanish prison, and they sent them there. But whether any of those guys survived or not, I don't know. I doubt it very much. But from then on, every time you'd slow down or something, boy, you'd get a pick handle across your back, and you'd get stood at attention and knocked down, and all kinds of things. Just mean, just hated us from then on.
They sent me to a place called Stalag 17A. And that wasn't all that bad because the Germans at war were still going pretty good for them. So they treated us pretty good. And if you wanted to get out of camp, you could bribe your way out with 2 cigarettes. But you had to be careful once you got out. See if they caught you around any railroad track or anything like that after dark. They didn't ask no questions. They shot you. And if you got out of a prison camp in the middle of Germany and you never had any money, your chances of paying out were pretty slim. The only hope you had was you'd get captured by somebody who wasn't going to shoot you. And so anyway, the escapes and one thing another got to be so rampant that they moved us to a place called Stalag 17B. And I remember the first formation we had when we got there, they lined us all up, and Sergeant Turk was the German in charge of the camp. He had a colonel above him, but he was the guy that did what the colonel said. He guided us all up, and we all had to stand there at attention. And he said, "Gentlemen, I must tell you this. Escaping will no longer be the sport. Anyone trying to escape will be shot." And we all threw our hats up in the air and cheered. And a couple of days later, somebody tried it. And he had a nice funeral. Escaping from Stalag 17B wasn't like Hogan's Heroes and the movie. It was damn serious business. You'd have to get shot.
When we all arrived in Shanghai, until day whatever it was to come home from Japan, we were inundated with lice in our clothes and fleas. And that was the darndest thing you can ever experience, is to have your clothing filled with lice and no way to get rid of them. At night before you go to bed, you'd try to take off your clothes and kill all the lice with your fingernails, but you could never get them all. And in the morning there'd be a new supply of them. And the fleas jumping all over all the time. But working in that shipyard, my brother and I were able to take our clothes off and put them in boiling water, and that kills lice and fleas very rapidly, instantly. So we had an advantage working there in that shipyard. However, the war was about to come to an end in 1945, and what we experienced there was mass bombings of Osaka by the American B-29s and P-51s. And our shipyard was destroyed, and so was part of our camp. Just before that was probably about 4 months before the war ended. And so they had to get us out of there. They marched us to a train, and we were taken up into northern Japan, where they had a stainless steel mill. And we were what you might call slave laborers again, just carrying things around from one place to the other in that stainless steel plant until the war ended. I would say in Osaka, during the daytime, we were always with civilians. The Japanese guards were surrounding the shipyard so that nobody's you would never try to escape there. You couldn't go anywhere. But the Japanese would march you there, and you didn't interface with them all day long. So the civilians were very. In fact, if it hadn't been for some of us, they helped us. They helped provide little bits of food, and they were starving themselves, but they felt compassionate. That didn't happen in Shanghai, but it did in Osaka. It didn't happen up in northern Japan either. And we appreciate that. I could never locate those people, though, that befriended us. I tried.
Camp life wasn't that bad. We got parcels. Red Cross deserves a lot of credit for keeping me alive there. And I continue to remember them with periodic contributions. The Red Cross parcel had enough basic food in, even without what the Germans gave you, probably to keep you, it would keep you alive and in reasonable physical shape. The Germans gave us potatoes and hot water for coffee in the morning with they gave you ersatz stuff, the bread was black bread. And first time I got it when in the farmhouse, I didn't like it, but then it tasted like cake after a few months. They marched us out when the Russians got within about 15 miles, and that was the worst experience. The 3 weeks on the road, and then finally into boxcars. And I remember walking along crying, and I got mad. I said, "You're not going to kill me like this." I had frozen tears on my face. I was just exhausted. And it was always 6 more kilometers to go. We were told not to escape. The colonel said, "You could be court-martialed if you escape," because he said the Germans had SS men on the perimeters, and especially the Hungarian SS. If they pick you up, they just shoot you. He said, "So you are under orders not to escape." I got down to a little town called Gamelsdorf, and I could hear the artillery. I could hear 105s or whatever they were, 155s, and I knew the Americans were coming. And I said, "Geez, I'm just going to stay here. I'm not going to." And we were told the next morning we were going to go into the permanent camp, and then the capper was that was the day that we were told by laughing Germans that Roosevelt is dead. Roosevelt is tot. Ha ha. And that. I'd never lost a president before. But I said to myself, I'm tired of this. I don't want to go back into another camp. The American Army is going to be here in the next couple of days. I'll just stay behind. After 2 days, the artillery stopped, and I said, "Oh, they swung somewhere else, and I'm going to run out of food here, and I'm going to have to give myself up, and I don't want to do that because they'll kill me." And so I said, "Well, I know where I am, and I know where I have to go. And so over the next 10 or 12 days, I walked about 120 kilometers down to Kempton and Dornbirn, and finally got down to the and there's a point of Switzerland that is joined by Germany and Austria, and it's very mountainous, and you travel valleys, but there are signposts that tell you where you are, and again there's so many refugees. There's thousands of Germans moving around trying to get out of the Russian zone. That there's just mass confusion. The only problem I had in traveling that is that I didn't have any papers, and I couldn't walk across a bridge. So what do you do when you can't walk across a bridge? You have to swim the river. So I was always wet, and there's nothing as wet as a GI overcoat. You can take your shirt off and dry your pants out, but that coat never dries. And I swam 4 rivers. Finally got down to the border, and I knew it was the border into Switzerland because I knew it was the Rhine River. And there was a barbed wire on the German side, substantial barbed wire, double system with tangle wire in the middle. Watched the German guards and their dogs walk it, so I used the same, and they would walk it at 4 o'clock, and then they would walk it the next morning. And I said, I got to get out of here. And if I'm going to do it, I'm going to get out at night. So I got down to the wire, and of course then I realized that I didn't exactly know where the Germans had walked, and I started to say, this could be bad, because Germans were known to mine their barbed wire fence systems, either internally as you touch the wire, or mostly in the ground, 3 feet down. So I started to dig, and I didn't have any tools, and I bloodied my hands and got through the first strands. The tangle wire was the worst, because you can't avoid it. You lift it, and just when you think you're out, it's caught your pants, and I ripped myself up quite a bit, and finally got through. And going through the last one, I was so afraid that I was going to die or be caught there and shot that my tongue stuck to the top of my mouth. And that's an awful feeling. I had no moisture in my body. So I was dehydrated, totally fearful. Then I stumbled, ripped my clothes, ripped my head, stumbled into the Rhine River, which isn't a big river at that point. It was probably 100 yards wide, flowing rather swiftly because it's just coming down out of the Alps, and floated, with the flow of the river, and I could touch the ground near the bottom in most places, but I could swim too, and kind of got myself up to the other bank and just kind of collapsed, kind of fitfully passed out. Got up the next morning, all stiff, cold as hell, and stumbled out on this little road and walked along. I didn't know. I just knew I had to go somewhere, rather than just sit there and die. And I was stumbling along this road, and this guy in a bike came roaring around the corner, and he stops and gets off the bike, and he's got a uniform on. It looks like a German uniform, a blue-gray uniform. And I said, oh God, after all this, didn't I get out? I thought maybe I'd cross back in or did some dumb thing. I was really almost delirious at that time. And I kind of stumbled to him, and I said, I got within about 20 feet. I don't know what I look like, but it would be nice to have that picture right now. But he was kind of apprehensive, because I was covered with blood and all sorts of things, mud and wet, miserable, mean looking probably. And I said, Ich bin Amerikaner. And this guy said, Je suis.
We were impounded in Bilibid prison, which is the north edge of Manila. And from there we were taken on up to a railroad station not far from there. And they had little cars, little railroad cars. They called them, they were the size of the French 40 and 8. 40 and 8 being for 40 soldiers or 8 horses. And they put 100 of the prisoners in each one, and then the order came down that they had to put in 15 more. And so with prodding with bayonets and shoving and yelling and screaming, which they did a lot of, they would get in as many more as they could. And then this was in May, and it was very hot in the tropics. And they closed up the doors, and they had boarded up all of the air vents and everything there. And we stayed there through that day, and the air got very bad, and it got very hot, and some of the fellows had dysentery, and you couldn't move around. You just breathe in the face of the one that was facing you. And as fellows would die, they would gradually sink down, and all you could do was stand on them. And it reminded me of back on the farm in the wintertime when we'd have late spring bad weather, and little chickens would be under the brooder stove in the little chicken house. And as the young ones would freeze to death, or some of them would freeze to death and die, the others would stand on them and all crowd together to keep warm. And that reminded me of this in that terrible situation in that boxcar. Well, they moved us on up, and eventually we got up to another camp called Cabana Tawan. We went up to Camp 3, which was beyond 1 and 2. And we were impounded there, and I recall a lot of the fellows getting bayoneted on the way because they were so weak they couldn't keep up. And they would be screamed at and beat, and as they would collapse, they would be killed. And one of the fellows right at the gate, when they stopped us to inspect us, offered $100 American money for a drink of water, and of course no one had any. And to make his point, he held up a $100 bill and repeated it, and one of the guards saw it, Japanese guards, and came over and jerked his canteen away from him, and he had stuffed it with $100 bills. And so they took him off and, as I said, punished him severely, which meant after they tortured him, they killed him. And then we went on into camp. We were taken by trucks from Camp 1 down to Manila, put back in Bilibid, and then the next day we were marched down to be put in these ships. And the ship that we were put in was an old, very dilapidated ship. I didn't think it would even float. But anyway, we were shoved in there so tight and so close. They would move 100 group in at a time, and it was really packed in there. And we had to go over the gunwale that was about 18 inches high and drop down into this hole, which was probably 16 or 17 feet deep. And if you didn't move fast enough, the guard would just kick you and knock you over into there, and you would fall. And the first hold was filled up, and our group was next to fill in the front hold of the 2 holds in the ship. And so as I went down in there, I noticed the rack at the back, and there were 2 fellows up on it already. And so I crawled up with them, and the rest of them packed in there. And we were on the ship from that time for 2 months getting to Japan. And this was a time when there were a lot of American submarines out there. These were unmarked ships, and they were covered on the deck with contraband from the Philippines, rolls of wire, scrap metal, and things that they could melt down. And so there was no way for the American subs to know that there were prisoners in there. And we would start out to go out into the China Sea out there, and then they would come back in, and back and forth and back and forth. And during this time, they would let down maybe a can of tea, weak tea, or a can of half-cooked rice for all of these hundreds of men. And there was no way that you could get any of it. And if you did get it, you'd probably get into a terrible fight. And it got to the point where men were going stark raving mad. But anyway, the fellow on my right started screaming one night and kicking. And we helped pull his leg back up, and one of the other prisoners had gone completely berserk and was chewing on his toes. And when it got light, we saw that one of his toes had been chewed off and part of the other one, and apparently he was so numb and so paralyzed he didn't realize what was happening until it got quite painful. Anyway, there was a lot of things like that went on those hell ships. And those are things that it's hard for anyone that hears it or reads about it to really realize the condition that existed there. Because in reading it or listening to it, you can't feel the heat, or you can't feel the desperation, or the revert to the animal type that I guess we all are without civilization. But as we docked in Japan proper on the island of Kyushu, the southern island, I don't remember it at all. I was unconscious, but I know that when I came to, I was laying on a cement floor that looked to me like a cowshed, and it had a cement gutter there for like they have behind the stanchioned cows in a cow barn. And some of the other prisoners were there, and they told me that we were now in Japan, and that we were on the southern island. And the next thing I remember was that they were marching us out to get some food. And the interpreter, they had a pretty good interpreter then who we could understand. And he was telling us that now we would be issued warm clothing, and we'd be getting toksan, which was a lot of food, and that we would be now considered as prisoners of war, and we would have the pleasure of being the guest of the emperor, and that we would be assigned to different work details.